Hi guy, welcome back TV spoilers. Victor had built his life on control the way other men built theirs on faith. In Genoa City, he wasn't simply a husband, a father, or a powerful figure whose name carried weight. Was the man who always knew where every door led, who held the keys to every room, and who refused to be the last one to understand what was happening inside his own world. But sometimes the thing that shakes a man like Victor Newman isn't an enemy with a clear agenda, or a rival with a polished smile. Sometimes it's something small enough to look harmless, a hug. And that afternoon, in a public coffee shop where warm lighting softened the edges of everyone's faces, and the quiet clink of spoons against cups made the room feel ordinary, Victor saw something that hit him like a blade pressed directly against his pride. Nikki and Jack were embracing. It wasn't the brief, polite kind of contact that could be dismissed as a friendly gesture. It lasted long enough to ignite Victor's most ruthless instincts. It felt intimate enough to drag old history out of the shadow memories of the times. Jack had once been a refuge for Nikki, and the times Victor had had to fight not just for power, but for the center of her heart. Victor didn't walk up like a man who simply happened to run into his wife. He approached like a confrontation taking human form. His presence altered the air around him, turning something soft into something sharp. The discomfort in his eyes hardened into suspicion, and suspicion fed instantly into anger, not because Victor truly believed Nikki had crossed a physical line, but because the hug itself carried a message. It said Nikki had gone to Jack before she had gone to him. It said she had found strength in another man's arms while her husband, the man who prided himself on being her foundation, stood outside the moment like an outsider. And for Victor, that was an insult carved into principle. It suggested that somewhere, somehow, the Newman family was cracking in a way he hadn't been able to seal. The room seemed to freeze at the sight of him. Nikki pulled back, startled, as if she'd been caught breathing in a place she wasn't allowed to. Jack straightened immediately, not in guilt, but in the familiar awareness that Victor Newman never walked into a scene without turning it into a trial. Nikki knew Victor would treat the hug as evidence. Jack understood that even the cleanest truth could be twisted into something poisonous once Victor decided what he wanted to believe. Yet Nikki's deepest fear wasn't Victor's jealousy. It was his timing. He had appeared at the exact moment she'd finally let herself weaken. At the exact moment she'd reached for the only kind of comfort she'd felt safe accepting that day, because she'd been carrying a secret so heavy she couldn't breathe around it. Victor didn't waste time. He demanded an explanation immediately, his voice calm enough to remain controlled, but edged enough to make everyone in the vicinity feel they were standing too close to danger. With Victor, truth was never something people offered when they felt ready. It was something he took when he decided it was time. Nikki felt her throat tighten because she knew she couldn't lie. Victor always knew when she lied, but telling the truth felt like stepping onto a bridge she wasn't sure would hold her weight. And before Nikki could find the right words, Jack moved first, not because he wanted to challenge Victor, but because he understood what Victor could do to Nikki if he was allowed to fill in the blanks with his imagination. Jack revealed that Nikki had shared a critical secret with him, something connected to Matt Clark's attacker, to Victor's AI program. The project Victor had been pursuing like a weapon meant to secure the Newman legacy for generations. The words landed like a sudden shift in gravity, because in Victor's world, some names weren't casual references. They were war. Matt Clark was not the kind of person you mentioned in public unless you were prepared for the consequences. And AI wasn't just technology, it was Victor's power, his future, his belief that he could outpace every rival by rewriting the rules of the game itself. If Nikki was carrying a secret tied to either one, then she was standing at the center of something volatile. And what irritated Victor most wasn't simply the secret. It was the fact that she had taken it to Jack. Nikki forced herself to hold her ground even as she felt exposed. She explained that what she knew wasn't small and it wasn't safe. It wasn't the kind of information she could casually confess over dinner without risking an explosion. She'd seen signs enough to convince her that Victor's AI program, or the way it was being handled, could put the Newman family in real danger. She wasn't being dramatic. She wasn't trying to create chaos. She was speaking like someone who had been awake for too many nights, staring into uncertainty and realizing that the danger might be growing inside the very machine Victor was determined to build. Nikki had lived beside Victor long enough to understand the cost of ambition. She knew how his confidence could block out caution, how his hunger for control could blind him to the possibility of being used. And because Victor believed so completely in the brilliance of his plan, Nikki had started to fear that he might be walking into a trap without even knowing it. Jack reinforced the point Victor seemed most determined to ignore. The hug wasn't betrayal. It wasn't seduction. It wasn't a secret romance resurrected for the thrill of it. It was human. It was comfort offered to Nikki when she was under pressure strong enough to break her. Jack made it clear Nikki hadn't come to him searching for a replacement for Victor. She'd come because she needed someone who could listen without turning everything into war. Someone who understood the stakes of Victor's world and could recognize when a threat was bigger than pride. Someone outside the Newman family's emotional storm. Someone whose perspective wasn't clouded by devotion, fear, or loyalty. But for Victor Newman, logic didn't erase humiliation. His mind split into two brutal directions and both felt dangerous. One part of him wanted to believe Nikki. He wanted to trust that she was trying to protect their family. That she had sensed something wrong and acted out of love. Yet the other part of him, part shaped by decades of power and paranoia, saw a pattern he couldn't tolerate. Nikki hiding something. Nikki going to Jack. Nikki embracing Jack. Nikki explaining only after being caught. Even if every reason made sense. The sequence still created an image Victor hated, an image of Nikki choosing someone else as her first instinct, someone else as her shelter, someone else as the person she trusted with fear. Nikki looked at Victor and felt punished for caring too much. Loving Victor had always meant weathering storms. But she was exhausted by the constant demand to be perfect in how she delivered the truth. She was tired of needing the exact tone, the exact timing, the exact level of softness to prevent Victor's pride from turning into suspicion. One hug had pushed her into a corner like a criminal. And she could feel something inside her hardening, a quiet bitterness that she had done what she believed was right, yet still stood accused. She wanted Victor to understand that silence could have been fatal. But honesty felt just as dangerous because Victor didn't just hear information. He heard implications. He heard challenges. He heard threats to his control. Jack, for his part, remained steady, but the weariness in him ran deep. He had lived through too many cycles in Genoa City to be surprised by Victor's reaction. Every kindness he offered Nikki had always been twisted into something darker in Victor's mind. Jack didn't need to win this confrontation. He only needed Nikki not to be destroyed by it. Yet Jack also understood the hardest truth of all. Once Victor Newman sensed secrecy, he would not stop until he tore every layer away himself. And Victor's investigations were never purely about truth. They were about restoring dominance. They were about ensuring he was never the last to know again. The scene didn't end with shouting or with dramatic exits. It ended with something colder than anger. Silence. The kind of silence that didn't soothe but warned. Victor paused, and Nikki felt the weight of that pause like a judgment being formed in real time. She realized Victor was deciding what mattered more, the hug or the secret. And in Victor's world, love and power never lived separately. If Nikki knew something about AI, it was a business threat. If she had taken it to Jack, it became a loyalty issue. 2 strikes in one breath. Enough to push Victor into a place where he felt he had to reclaim control, not just in his company, but in his marriage. When Victor turned away, he didn't say he believed her, and he didn't say he didn't. He left behind only that sharpened look, a look that promised this story wasn't over. Nikki remained in the coffee shop, her chest heavy, her thoughts spiraling. She didn't know what terrified her more, the possibility that Victor would investigate and discover she was right, or the possibility that he would investigate and decide she was wrong, then label her the problem. The instability, the weakness within the Newman fortress. Jack watched Victor go, already knowing the truth. What had just happened wasn't resolution. It was ignition. From that moment, the trust between Victor and Nikki no longer felt seamless. It developed hairline cracks. And Victor was the kind of man who would pry those cracks open with his bare hands, simply to see what lay beneath them. He made the decision to dig deeper into Matt Clark, into the attack, into every detail of the AI program Nikki feared, and into the real reason Nikki had chosen Jack as the first person to hear what she knew. The terrifying part was that Victor wasn't investigating only to protect the family. He was investigating to protect himself from the unbearable sensation that he had been shut out. And in Victor Newman's investigations, something always suffered. Truth came out, yes, but so did old wounds. So did buried resentments. So did doubts that grew teeth once they were fed. Nikki's secret wasn't just information. It was a threat capable of shifting the Newman family's balance of power. If AI had been compromised, or if it was connected to the patterns of attack tied to Matt Clark, then Victor could have been building the very weapon his enemies needed to destroy him. If Matt Clark wasn't a ghost from the past but a hand still moving pieces on the board, then Victor's confidence might have been nothing more than a blindfold. And if Nikki knew more than she had dared to say in that coffee shop, then her silence, no matter how loving her reasons, would only strengthen Victor's suspicion that the danger wasn't outside the family at all. It was inside. As night settled over Genoa City, Victor Newman stopped being the wounded husband haunted by a hug. He became the strategist, again cold, alert, unforgiving. And while Nikki tried to convince herself she had done what she needed to do to protect the people she loved, a new dread took shape in her heart. Victor's investigation might uncover things no one wanted unearthed. And the most brutal possibility wasn't that Victor would find evidence of a threat. It was that he would find evidence of something worse, proof that someone had accessed his AI program before he had, manipulated it, corrupted it, and that the person Victor would look at first, with suspicion sharp enough to cut, might be Nikki herself. And as Victor slid into his car and the door shut behind him like a sealed verdict, one thought struck him with the force of a warning he couldn't ignore. If Nikki was right about the AI, then someone had been inside his system long before he realized it. And the only question left was whether that person was working for Matt Clark or working from within the Newman family's own walls. Jack was not the kind of man who panicked easily in Genoa City. He had lived too long in a world where every handshake could be a warning. Every polished smile could hide a blade. But this time, the unease crawling under his skin didn't come from a loud scandal or an obvious enemy. It came from Billy, his brother, the one Jack had protected and doubted in equal measure for years. The one he had defended even when disappointment kept trying to harden into resignation. Jack had watched Billy promise growth too many times, watched him swear he'd changed, watched him insist he was done with reckless impulses and self-destructs. And yet Billy's new version of himself always carried a familiar scent, not the clean, steady smell of true maturity, but the sharp, convincing fragrance of fresh paint slapped over old cracks, spready, persuasive, and still fragile enough to split open the moment pressure hit the right spot. It began with something that could have been dismissed as accidental. If Jack hadn't learned that nothing in their lives was ever truly accidental, he discovered Billy had met with Kane in secret. Not an unexpected run-in, not a casual exchange of pleasantries, but a deliberate meeting arranged with the kind of careful privacy that signaled a deal being shaped behind closed doors. Jack didn't need to hear every word to understand the gravity of what he'd stumbled upon. He recognized the body language, the quiet intensity, the way real negotiations always carried the weight of ambition even when no one said it out loud. The moment Chancellor Industries surfaced in Jack's mind, his warning instincts flared. Billy was never innocent around anything tied to Chancellor, especially not when Kane was the one offering an opportunity the kind that looked beneficial on the surface, but almost always demanded a price people didn't recognize until they were already drowning. Jack didn't hate Billy. That was the cruelest part. He loved him in the most exhausting way love could exist, love that came with vigilance, love that required constant calculation, love that never allowed him to relax into trust completely because history had taught him what happened when he did. He wanted Billy to have stability. He wanted his brother to truly stop chasing risk like it was proof of existence. But Jack's love had never been blind, and it had never been gentle enough to ignore reality. It was the kind of love that came with responsibility, and responsibility sometimes demanded choices that made people furious. What Jack saw now was not simply a questionable meeting. He saw Billy hiding something darker beneath the glossy story he'd been telling Sally, using unchanging as both a shield and a distraction. Billy had been wearing redemption like a tailored suit in front of Sally, and Sally had been trying to believe it because belief was easier than fear. But Jack recognized the pattern because he had lived through it too many times. Billy was using Sally's biggest anxiety, her fear that he would slip back into old habits, as leverage. Every time she worried he was spiraling again, Billy could soothe her with soft promises and wounded sincerity, making her feel guilty for doubting him, making her feel responsible for the very trust he was exploiting. And that was what disgusted Jack most. The danger wasn't only the secret meeting with Kane. The danger was the mechanism Billy had built around Sally's emotions, turning her concern into something he could manage and manipulate, whether he admitted it to himself or not. Jack also understood the stakes beyond their relationship. Abbott Communications wasn't just a company, it was a foundation Sally had been building with hard-earned focus and sharp instincts. If Billy was being drawn into something murky involving Chancellor Industries, Sally could be pulled under with him without realizing how deep the water was until it was too late. And Jack could already see the shape of the disaster before it happened, a risky agreement that looked brilliant at first, a hidden complication that came later. The company's reputation dragged through suspicion, resources drained by consequences no one planned for. Billy always believed he could control the game once he got his hands on it. Jack had seen enough to know that control was often just an illusion Billy clung to, while everything around him burned. That was why Jack decided silence would make him complicit. He arranged to meet Sally privately, not with dramatic flair, not with cruelty, but with the urgency of someone trying to place the truth on the table before it became a bomb. Still, even with his decision made, Jack couldn't fully silence the discomfort twisting inside him. He knew how this would look. He knew Billy would accuse him of meddling, of trying to sabotage, of treating him like a child who couldn't be trusted. Jack knew he would become the villain in Billy's eyes, the controlling brother who couldn't stand to see Billy have something of his own. But Jack didn't care about being liked. He cared about fallout. And if he waited too long, the fallout would bury people who didn't deserve to be buried. When Jack sat across from Sally, he saw exactly what he'd feared: strength held together by tension. Composure stretched tight over something unstable. Sally was not naive. She was not fragile. But Jack could tell she'd been living with a quiet, unresolved suspicion for weeks, the kind that never fully fades. The kind that stays in the body like a dull ache. She wanted peace with Billy, and that desire had softened her caution. She had invested too much in this relationship to want to imagine it collapsing. And Jack understood that, because he'd made those same kinds of choices before, cases where the heart insisted on hope, even while the mind whispered warnings. Jack didn't waste time with vague hints. He laid out what he knew in clear, connected detail: Billy's secret meeting with Kane, the conversation circling around a favorable arrangement tied to Chancellor Industries, the secrecy of it all. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't paint Kane as a monster for the sake of drama. He simply placed the truth where it belonged, because in Genoa City truth was never harmless, but it was always necessary. The moment Jack finished, Sally's expression didn't explode into a loud reaction. It went still. The shock spread through her like ink bleeding into paper, slow, inevitable, impossible to stop once it started. Her mind immediately began pulling up fragments of Billy's recent behavior, pieces that hadn't quite fit before but now locked into place with chilling clarity. The reassuring speeches, the carefully chosen words about growth, the moments he seemed almost too calm, too rehearsed, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince her. Sally didn't want to believe Jack. A part of her resisted with instinctive loyalty, with the stubborn hope that Billy had finally become the man he promised to be. But another part of her, the sharp survivor who had clawed her way through boardrooms and battles, recognized the alarm signals immediately. The secret wasn't just a secret. It was a decision Billy had made without her. And it wasn't only what he did that hurt, it was what it implied about how he saw her. Jack watched her absorb it, and he hated the pain he'd caused. But he hated the potential disaster even more. He explained what mattered most. It wasn't only that Billy met Kane. It was the way Billy had been operating, using Sally's fear of his old patterns as a tool. Every time she questioned him, Billy could paint himself as the wounded man trying to be better. And Sally would instinctively soften, afraid of being unfair, afraid of pushing him away. That dynamic was subtle and dangerous. It didn't require Billy to tell giant lies. It only required him to leave out enough truth for Sally to fill the silence with love. Sally left that meeting with her emotions in a storm, but her face controlled. She didn't speak much because she didn't trust her voice. Inside her, everything was rearranging itself. She thought about Abbott Communications not as a business plan, but as a fragile structure she'd built with her own hands. She'd fought too hard for her credibility to let it be gambled away by someone else's secret deal. And she knew Billy well enough to know what came next he would justify. He would frame it as strategy. He would insist he had it under control. He would say he was doing it for the future. Billy always found a way to make risk sound like vision. What rose in Sally wasn't loud anger at first. It was electric beneath her skin. It made her look backward, examining every small moment she'd previously dismissed because she wanted peace. She realized how often Billy had avoided specific questions, how easily he redirected conversations with softness, how frequently he soothed her with affection when she was too close to the truth. And Sally understood something that made her feel cold. Tenderness could be the most effective cover. It disarmed suspicion. It made doubt feel like betrayal. It convinced a person to stop digging. Eventually, Sally chose to confront Billy. Not impulsively, not with chaos, but with the controlled force of a woman who had learned that hesitation was how people got trapped. She demanded a clear explanation about the secret meeting with Kane. But the question wasn't truly about why he met Kane. It was a test of integrity. Would Billy tell the truth without twisting it? Would he own what he'd done, or would he reshape reality until it sounded acceptable? And deeper than all of it was the question Sally couldn't ignore anymore. Had Billy kept her in the dark because he respected her or because he assumed she was easier to manage than to trust? Billy stood in front of her, caught in the position he hated most, forced to explain himself. Dragged out of the safe space where he controlled the narrative. He could see the suspicion in Sally's eyes like a cold knife. And he didn't need her to say Jack's name to know Jack had interfered. Billy wasn't stupid. He understood exactly what Jack would have done and why. And the part of him that wanted to be angry at Jack also recognized a brutal truth. Jack wasn't wrong to worry. Kane was a temptation. Chancellor Industries was a temptation. And Billy had always been vulnerable to the kind of temptation that made him feel powerful again. Inside Billy, the conflict churned in a way he didn't want to admit. He wanted to prove to Sally that he'd changed, that he could keep this relationship intact, that he could finally be steady. He wanted Sally to be proof that he was more than his worst instincts. But he was also drawn to the deal, to the thrill of a larger game, to the intoxicating feeling that he could win something big and silence every person who had ever dismissed him. Billy didn't want to call it a relapse. He wanted to call it ambition. He wanted to call it strategy. He wanted to call it growth. And the more he tried to rename it, the more Sally could feel the truth slipping out between his words. Sally didn't need Billy to be perfect. She needed him to be honest. But standing there, she sensed honesty was becoming something Billy weighed like an option rather than something he lived like a rule. And that realization exhausted her. She had survived too many relationships built on delayed truth and softened lies. She didn't want to repeat old cycles dressed up in new promises. She didn't want Abbott Communications to become collateral damage in a gamble Billy believed he could control. Elsewhere, Jack wasn't at peace either. He knew he had lit a fuse. He told himself he had done the right thing. But doing the right thing didn't erase the damage it caused. He worried about Sally, about the company. But he also worried about Billy in the way he never wanted to confess out loud. He feared Billy would fall into the same pattern again, recklessness disguised as brilliance. Risk disguised as destiny, and drag everyone close to him down with him. Jack had watched Billy rebuild himself too many times to believe this would resolve on its own. And that was why he acted, even knowing Billy would hate him for it. The tension around all of them thickened like fog. No one seemed fully certain where they stood anymore. Sally wasn't sure Billy was the man she thought she was choosing. Billy wasn't sure he could keep Sally while still chasing a deal that tempted the darkest parts of his nature. Jack wasn't sure whether protecting people would save them or simply change the shape of the damage. It felt like a chessboard where every move revealed a deeper fracture underneath, a crack that had existed long before this deal ever entered the room. And the most unsettling part was that nothing had truly exploded yet. This wasn't the disaster. It was the first sharp sound of something beginning to break. Sally hadn't decided who she trusted or what she would do next. Billy hadn't been forced to admit whether he was truly changing or simply becoming better at hiding. Jack hadn't learned whether his warning would protect Abbott Communications or push everything into a different kind of chaos. The only certainty was the lingering uncertainty and unanswered question, hanging in the space between them like a thin wire pulled tight. If Billy could hide a meeting with Kane, what else could he hide? And if Sally kept pulling on the thread of suspicion, would she stop at one truth, or would she unravel something she wasn't sure she even wanted to see? Once it was fully exposed, on our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.